Okay, I think I'll get started and maybe people will join in the next few minutes. Osei, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Hi, everyone. I'm just turning my camera on.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, everyone, welcome to our final BA and Graduate Showcase event for today. And welcome back if you were here earlier. This afternoon, we've got Osei Bonsu, who is a British Ghanaian curator, critic and art historian based in London and Paris. His activities encompass exhibition, programming, publishing and cultural strategy in the field of visual arts. He's developed projects focused on transnational histories of art, collaborating with museums, galleries and private collections nationally and internationally, including the Jeu de Paume in Paris, the Centre for Contemporary Art at Bordeaux, and Saatchi Gallery in London. Osei Bonsu is a curator of international art at Tate Modern and a contributing editor at Frieze magazine. Welcome, Osei.
Hi, everyone.
And thank you for coming back, because we've had you already this year when you came a few weeks ago and spoke to our final year students. And it's fantastic to have you here. Engaging with the showcase. Just a little bit of housekeeping, everyone. If just make sure that your mics are off for now, and you can use the chat function, which I will ask Osei towards the end. I'll be able to see your questions, and then I'll pass it on. So, Osei, how do you want to do this? Should we?
Well, just as a bit of housekeeping, I think that. Oh no, I think it's just Zinta. Sorry to call you out. It's just because I can see whose mic's on and whose mic is off. Zinta still has her mic on, or their mic on.
I think it's off now, isn't it?
No, it's still on according to my screen.
On mine, it says it's off.
Oh, great, it's off. Thank you for that. Sorry, I do it myself. Forget to leave my to turn my mic off, and then you hear the background noise or the dog barking or the ambulance outside, so it's good just to get a bit of neutrality and to kind of keep the space as noise pollution free as possible. So with that, I've had the unenviable task of looking through a lot of your work for your final degree show projects and been really impressed by the quality, but also how all of you have managed in such kind of trying and I think sort of at sometimes frustrating moments of having to think creatively while in isolation, manage to make work that is in equal parts, compelling and really kind of progressive and forward thinking in terms of what it's offering up. And I do understand that when you're putting together a degree show project, you have limited resources. Sometimes you're working within not only the physical confinement of your own home, but, lack of access to materials. Many of you might make work that involves collaboration and you've not been able to collaborate in the way that you would have in normal circumstances. So I want to first just congratulate you all for this work that you've been doing for the last few months. I'll give you a little clap.
Thanks for that.
Yeah. So as anyone who knows my relationship to Mary, there's nothing I won't do for Mary. She's an extraordinary artist and professor at Chelsea and has been kind of consistently, I think, really eager to bring the art world into the university and to find ways, means and mechanisms of exchange. And I think that is incredibly enriching because I think, as someone that studied at UAL many years ago, I did find it sometimes frustrating that you've got your kind of interior world, which is your university and the communities that you're building, and then the art world, which exists in parallel, but you don't necessarily feel a part of it or included in it, especially those of you who might not have grown up in London, who might not feel necessarily that you found your footing in the city yet. It can be a very alienating experience. So I'm really glad that Mary has obviously extended the invitation for me to talk to you all, and I'm happy to field any questions that you have, whether they're about my own background or working in the art world or being a practicing artist in London. Although I'm a curator, I obviously work a lot with practicing artists and emerging artists, and really anything it is that you want to know about how the art world works. And obviously I'm for just under a year now curator of international art at Tate Modern, and that comes with lots of I think sort of specific kinds of knowledge and experiences that I'm also happy to share and talk about. So I'm kind of happy to open the floor as much as possible, but I think, Mary, should we start with the portfolios or the works that are
Yeah.
that I've kind of pointed out as being maybe worth discussing? Yeah.
Are you able to share your screen?
I am. I'm just trying to find a way to do it in a, gosh, it's been a while.
Let me know if you can't, because then I should be able to do it.
I think I can do it. Okay, here we go. So this is my desktop share. So it should be sharing now.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm just going to open this up. So I mean, one of the difficulties of a degree show like yours is that you're obviously having to put the works online, and the only things that I can see online are, you know, images in the first instance, and then some text where you've been able to elaborate slightly on what it is that the work is trying to do, or what you may be trying to say as an artist. One of the things that I want to say to you all, and I know there are lots of international students among you for whom English is not your first language, and sometimes I know that there are artists who believe that, you know, less is more when it comes to an artist statement, and, you know, there are various ways of kind of finding ways to promote your work online. But the one thing I would say, and this is as someone that has in the past looked at degree shows online, actually, specifically from UAL, is actually, while it's sometimes useful to have the work speak for itself, you also have to recognize that online there's very limited capacity for the work to do that, because what you're dealing with ultimately is a single image, a set of pixels that may or may not represent the work adequately. And then you've got a text, which, as much as it can seem like having to write text is the kind of most arduous approach, because you're having to get all of your creative thoughts into kind of 3 neat paragraphs, it's actually a really important experience, because it's the moment where all of the critical faculties that you've been building throughout writing your dissertations, talking with one another, come into play. And even if you don't feel like, you know, English is the most easy language for you to navigate, it's also, I think, possible, I would imagine, Mary, for people to also use their own language in this context and to use other languages. I worked with an artist a year ago that didn't want a title for their show. They wanted to use emojis, and that was fine. It meant it was very difficult to reproduce on the press release. But it's just this idea that language is there to be used. It can sometimes betray us, and it's not always an easy friend. But I actually think that for those of you who feel like your work deserves further elaboration, I would argue that all good work does deserve more elaboration. Really think seriously about those statements and what you're putting out there to the world. So I wanted to start with this example by Joe Lawn, an artist who has put together a work that I think is really compelling from what I've read, and I'm just going to read what's on my screen. In Cameron Maria Machado's book, In a Dream House, she talks about archives, queerness, and what is archived. This results in gaps where people never see themselves or find information about themselves, holes that can make it impossible to give oneself context. Much of my work explores both attempting to find one's context and not having a context, and not having a context can lead to erasure. These were some of the feelings I was experiencing before I happened to stumble upon the history of the 1978 Railton Road. So I think that that's a really, really compelling premise to start to think about making work. I mean, I won't go into depth about this particular work, and I don't know Joe Lawn personally, but what I can say is that that's a really interesting example where an artist has said, here is my source, here is kind of what I'm thinking about, what I'm reading. It's a book that already existed. I didn't write the book, but I'm using it in order to think about a specific history in relation to, in this instance, queerness and the archive, that are incredibly, not only pertinent themes, but themes that I imagine have a personal relationship to the artist's own experience of this history. So it's an example where the artist is really setting up a field of discourse, a field of inquiry, that then for a curator, critic, art historian, we can begin to interrogate and think with that artist. So we're not starting from ground zero. It's also a work that happens to be about a social issue that obviously has topical relevance, which is useful. But rather than just saying, you know, my work is political because it's about queerness, Joe has given us a specific insight, a specific kind of portal into what that might mean to them. So I think that's a really, just an interesting example of what you can do with a statement. So that's the first work I was going to focus on. The next one is by Si-Yun Lee. Sorry if I'm butchering your name there. But I just thought this was a really good example also of a statement. So this showcase is about accepting our vulnerable present. For many reasons, and in many ways, we are fragile and isolated inside of ourselves, but try to ignore it. However, our common fragility might be a bridge to go beyond the segregated individual to connectivity with others. And, you know, those aren't necessarily terms that are unique. Lots of artists have tried to do this kind of thing before. You can think of performance artists in the 70s and 60s, you know, Viennese actionists, groups of conceptual artists in Britain who've tried to think about networks, about relationality, about how art connects to society. But here we have an artist who, through the image, and it's an image I recognize very well because it's the Millennium Bridge, and from St. Paul's, that's the exact view I have when I'm walking home from work every day, or before, you know, pre-COVID, walking home from work every day. And I just think it's an intervention that, while it's incredibly simple, that image illustrates exactly what it is that the artist is trying to do. So it's, I think, a really good example of an artist accepting kind of the fact that it's a performance, we can't relive it, but the image captures perfectly the intention, as does the statement. So that's just another work that I wanted to speak about. And then the other work, I hope I'm doing I can't remember if I'm on graduate, that was graduate diploma. This is also graduate diploma. So Melina Toma. So I focused on this work just because of its visual presence. And if you take the image of the work, and it says here that Melina Toma was born in Padova, I love Padova, in 1996, enrolled on a BA in Cultural Conservation and Heritage and Performing Arts at the University of Venice, and so on and so forth. A BA thesis in Mythological Fertility, Genesis and Resonances of Shape and Time. I guess in the work of George Kubler. And what I like about this person's work is that they're clearly taking ideas of craft, which are very present. The work calls to mind people like, you know, Sheila Hicks, that we'd be very familiar with, but does it in a way that feels quite personal to that artist's own experience. And I wanted to kind of here just touch on the idea that many of you will have skills that predate your lives as artists. So some of you might have backgrounds in accounting or weaving or, I don't know, social studies or political science. And to use all of that it's all useful, that somehow all of that knowledge that you cultivated prior to being an artist is actually the very thing that's going to make you an interesting artist. And I always give the example here of the fact that Lorna Simpson did secretarial work before she became a celebrated artist. And the reason that's important to say is because when you look at the body of work of an artist like Lorna Simpson, but there are many others that you could point to, you see the fact that they're not only calling upon references of art history, they're calling on references that relate to visual culture, to pop culture, to a kind of broader world of images. And I think this is an example of work that really evokes that, in the sense that it looks like an object that is very peculiar and very particular to the artist's own aesthetic language. And it's so important at this point, and I hope I don't sound preachy, but I'm just trying to say what I'd like to see more of, is that you really start to think, okay, what is it that I have to offer that other artists don't have? And even if it means that your work ends up evolving in a direction that seems strange or kind of uncanny or weird, actually that's to be celebrated, even if you don't end up being rewarded academically. I always argue that some of the best failures at art school then go on to be works that have a much more, you know, a much stronger presence in the art world, because if they're rejected by the academy, it means you're probably actually doing something right. So any time where you've had a bad critique or felt like your work isn't being acknowledged, it's I think a moment for you all to actually dig deeper and to think, well, why? What is it about this work that is throwing people off? And could I actually push that even further? So I just think that idea of kind of trying to find a language that is particular to your own experience is really important. And then I think we'll go on to the BA examples. So Jo Lawn was a BA example. The next is the artist Selena Tran, and this is called Serene Dissension. And I just think this statement at the beginning is really useful, and I'm going to try and get it so I can actually read the statement. It says here that I have realized that the common theme in my works during this time on the course is the search for safety, specifically at Chelsea and places or communities at Chelsea. The works I have previously exhibited at Chelsea are a lot of promotion of Chelsea there, which is great to have repeated, you know, where they've studied, are also a testament to myself, and that the experiences I have are indeed did indeed happen despite the gaslighting. So I think this is someone who clearly, and I saw this a lot while I was at UAL, had not an easy experience of the university. It comes through very much, not only in the repetition of Chelsea, but in the emphasis on questions of places or communities, the idea that there are, you know, the idea of gaslighting, the idea of personal truth being self-validated, publicly viewed or acknowledged. I think that's the kind of language of someone who is clearly trying to say, I've created a project that speaks directly to my experience of studying here, and I want you to understand what that experience might look like. And actually, I think that's incredibly pertinent. I always say that some of the best artists who are, let's say, defined British art of the latter half of the 20th century, defined themselves in opposition to their academic background or the pedagogical structures out of which they came. And within the context of UAL, you could use, you know, Gilbert and George as a really prominent example of artists that rejected the sculpture course and kind of found their own language by being, in a way, turning themselves into sculptures. You could talk about the feminist contingent of artists who were teaching, like Tina Keane or Anne Talentire in the 1980s, and really how pedagogy and art aren't always necessarily friendly bedfellows, and they often rub against one another in really productive and frustrating ways. And I think what this person's trying to do, Selena Tran, is to really articulate that frustration. I'm speaking again for them, so I may be completely wrong, and this is the kind of downside of doing a digital crit, is I may never know unless Selena pops up in the comment question and tells me that everything I said is wrong, which I'd be open to. And then Aisha Brooks, Protest for Progress. In a similar vein, this is a work that deals deeply with the politics as personal, or personal politics. And I wanted to just read out again the statement. With the current uproar of the Black Lives Matter protests, I do not want to be subjugated to the extremeness of whiteness, to the extremes of whiteness, and capitulated my anger and exhaustion towards the need to be seen or heard. People may find my work uncomfortable for the moments in which it is seen. However, I have been comfortable for my entire life in regards to racism, in regards to the racism I've experienced. So again, a very personal work. I was going to actually offer a critique in this sense, which is, I think that while the artist is actually clearly engaging with a topical issue that we all should be thinking about at the moment, how we work towards a society that's more equitable, and how we specifically in the British context account for the historic violence and subjugation of people of colour within this country that's gone unrecognised for so many years, and it is why so many conversations that are being had around statues, representation within our public institutions, is such a fraught issue, because it's been under the surface, and it's something that this person, Aisha Brooks, points out. I think that I'm not getting a clear sense here of what the work is. So when I go to the view work section, I see it's a video, and that video will just have a quick snippet of, I'm just going to show a minute. It's playing. So I think what I was going to mention in relation to this work is actually the statement doesn't seem to do much in terms of highlighting or illuminating how this artist is specifically addressing the question of Black Lives Matter. And obviously, when you start to watch the video, you see this kind of bird-like shape that, you know, with a kind of wound, and the wrappers of various chocolate bars are being thrown into that wound. And I imagine there might be a relationship there to slavery through the exportation of cocoa and sugar. There could be a suggestion about sugar refinement, which we all know is entangled with histories of empire and how particularly, you know, Britain generated its industrial wealth off the back of slavery. This person could be talking also about ecology and the devastation of the landscape, which is why this bird creature kind of forms out of this question of a kind of racialized wound. But actually none of that was present in the statement. So it's a really good example to think through, what is it that you can do? And it's called pigeonholing. So sorry, I've completely missed the memo, but the two things are very connected. And I would just say that's a really good example where, rather than starting with Black Lives Matter, the artist could have started with, well, what does pigeonholing mean? What does this chocolate signify? Or what do the wrappers of various produce signify? So I think that's just an example where you can really use your statement to be specific about your terms of political engagement. And then I think that was all, unless there was one other artist whose work I seem to have lost.
The Dorian.
Yeah.
Dorian Galen.
I think, here we go.
Yeah.
So Dorian Galen, I wanted to just talk about this work briefly, because when I watched the video, I guess I'm interested in this statement here, which is, it says, my key concern is investigating the experience of inhabiting the body. I draw on the personal nature of time, space, and memory, and rely on the continuous investigation of form, textures, and physicality of materials. The resulting works range from intimate to provocative to the universal. And I think that's a really beautiful statement that kind of captures really succinctly what it is that the artist is interested in at a very kind of bodily, sensory level. And what I really loved about the image in this instance is that it's a projection onto a row of terrace houses, you know, somewhere in the world. And I just thought it's really about all of you now thinking about post-COVID, if there ever is a post-COVID, or whether we're kind of doomed to this perpetual purgatory. But I do think that there's something to be said for thinking about public space. Who has right to public space? Where can you show work? And I think if there's anything that's come to the fore with questions around how statues are mobilized as kind of political pawns and what it means for artists to take ownership of public space, it's that there is, I think, a huge argument to be made increasingly for the value of temporality. And I think for those of you who make video, performance, time-based media, to really think about claiming public space again. You know, we're at a moment now where the kind of, you know, the world is slightly, you know, in a kind of pause mode. And you could indeed do a project like this and probably get away with it much more easily, because you could find spaces that aren't being policed or aren't being surveilled or supervised. And I'm not, you know, kind of encouraging anyone to go out and you know, vandalize public buildings. But I do think that an intervention like this is a really poetic example of how that intervention can be really generative for an audience. And how it can relate so beautifully to its landscape without knowing much about this particular work or about the artist. So that was my broad overview. I think you've all done incredibly well. I'm not just saying that. I think I probably would have broke down and had some kind of mental breakdown during lockdown. Working at Tate, that is always a possibility. But I think we all feel the pressures of having to be creative in these very trying times and having to think independently, but also knowing how connected we all are. So I think after this moment, it's really worth you reaching out to others, congratulating someone who you think has made amazing work and saying how much you appreciate their work, because they might feel as lonely and isolated as you do right now and might really need that kind of sense of validation from you. So I think that that's all I'm going to say, and I'm just going to open up to questions and, you know, whatever comes.
Thanks, Osei. That was just really good just to have a quick snapshot of what you thought of some of the work. I just have a question that is, it kind of bugs me. Every year, you know, we get, you know, a new cohort of students, and something that's come up for me as a question for the, I don't know, nearly 20 years of teaching is, students often say, does my work have to be about something? You know, it's often some of the work that you pointed out just now. You know, there's often a political or personal stroke political edge to it, and it's something that seems to concern students, especially when they start in the first year. That they often say, "Why does it have to be about something? What if it's not about anything?" What would you say to a student who asks that? I know it's a bit of a broad and general question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think your work does have to be about something. And I think when people say something, often they mean, does my work have to be political?
Yeah.
And that always frustrates me, because I think if there's anything that those artists that we just saw demonstrated, is that the work can be both. It's not an either or. You don't have to be necessarily making work about your identity in order for it to be valid, or in order for it to make a contribution to art history. Having said that, I think if you're an artist in this particular socio-political moment who's not reflecting deeply on what it means to be an artist, what it means to be a citizen, how your art actually contributes to some kind of discourse, maybe there is a question there as to what it is that you think art is for. And I think sometimes people do feel frustrated that maybe they feel that art has increasingly privileged those who are making more political work, or work that is led by a sense of social responsibility. But, you know, there is room for both. I mean, I still go back to work by artists who were making minimal work in the 60s, or artists who were making very simple conceptual interventions. And that work is still equally relevant, but I would say that it's relevant because the artist has a point of view. So I would say it's not that the work has to be about something, it's that the artist has to have a point of view.
Yeah, have some kind of opinion on something.
Yeah.
Or it doesn't, or not necessarily has to be overtly political or about something.
Not at all. I think actually when work strives to be overly political, it kind of loses some of that resonance. And I was giving, sorry, Aisha, to use your work as an example, but just an example of where the artist could have better kind of married the statement to the work. But that's just a question of editing and kind of thinking about how the work reads online. But it's no less important. I think you really see across all of those works how each artist is really personally invested in the subject.
Mm. One question that Katrine asked Rebecca earlier is that do you, as a curator, do you, as a general rule, kind of go around the degree shows at this time of year, you know, in the normal world? Is it something that you would do as part of your, you know, part of your practice as a curator?
It's not something that I do. I think there are curators that do that. I think part of the reason is that because I think actually while you're at university, you are finding your language as an artist, and I would argue that you're making your most I think probably some of your most honest work, but not necessarily some of your best work. And I actually think the moment for a lot of you is going to be what happens next. And what happens next is building your own website, creating a showcase with some of your friends, inviting people to some kind of online screening or talk. But I kind of want to get an opportunity to meet artists in their own context. And I think sometimes degree shows, it's so difficult to get a sense of what an artist is trying to do within the context of a degree show. Precisely because there are so many voices, and there are more and more people now studying at art school, and the courses are bigger and they're more international, and all of that's great, but it means that actually not that many of you are going to go on to necessarily make art immediately after graduating. Some of you might want to go away and do other things, and it's those who return to art when the going gets tough, when their back's against the wall and they've run out of money and they don't know what they're going to do. That's when the best work is made. It's when you actually don't think you have anything left in the tank. At the moment, you're kind of in a very cozy space, forgive me, of being within the context of a degree where your work is looked at by people like Mary and Catherine, who are going to give you feedback. Actually, the art world's not going to give you feedback. It's going to ignore your work in the first instance. And it might ignore your work for a very long time, more time than the work might even deserve to be ignored. But you have to be kind of prepared for that level of hardship in a way that comes with being an artist. It's not for the faint of heart, and I think it has to do with actually what you do the day you graduate, not what you did during your degree show. To be a bit glib, but it's true.
I mean, I think that our students have definitely shown resilience in this time. You know, This has been an incredibly difficult few months for, you know, for everyone in the world. But, you know, when you're studying, you're studying an art degree, you know, you need space, you need materials, you need to be able to be there with the work. And even even in the traditional degree show, which I know our students are really missing, you know, the kind of physicality of the space of, you know, when you're in a show, in the space, the physicality of being there, the architecture, etc., maybe even other people in the space with you, always seems to be an integral part of experiencing the work, you know. So seeing it like this, you know, on a screen, I was looking earlier, and there's some work that, you know, is so physical, and I remember some of it from when we were in the building. Some students' work is just so, the physicality of it is so palpable that you kind of have to be there. So seeing it here on the screen is like, oh, well, you know, not quite, you know, the kind of right experience. But no, I think that our students have definitely shown their resilience in that sense. But yeah, I think you're right. You kind of, not that you have to endure hardship in order to make art, but I think that one thing that, correct me if I'm wrong, anyone, any of you students, that one thing that I know that I did after I finished my MA at Goldsmiths was I spent a couple of years trying to de-institutionalize myself. You know, that I think that maybe that's something that students will do. Like you said, you know, as long as they persevere and carry on, they'll push through and find their language in some way without the bubble of the institution being with them.
Well, if you take, Mary, your work as an example, and I'm only saying this because obviously everyone here has a personal connection to you, it's really an example of a practice that I think has kind of expanded in its formal, aesthetic, political preoccupations over time. And actually, you don't have to make your best work at university. That's not the point. The point is that you kind of... Yeah, it's a starting point. And it's also a point where you kind of rip up the rules in order to rewrite them. And as much as that's a cliche, it's actually really important. More than it is about learning, it's a process of kind of unlearning and undoing a lot of the structures of what makes a successful artwork in order to build back up from the ground up again. And I can see among some of you that sense of really having a very strong commitment to a particular aesthetic or sort of formal approach is really present. And I would argue that actually now is the time to kind of break that up a little bit and forget about it, and then maybe come back to it when you feel as if you've tried other things. And I know you've been experimenting throughout this time, but, you know, there was a show last year that I was fortunate to work on that, you know, Mary, you know, ultimately was key in me getting this opportunity, but it was an opportunity to look at the history of the university. And one of the artists I was looking at was the British sculptor Bill Woodrow, that after graduating found himself being, you know, a father, living, you know, in a domestic life with a partner and other responsibilities, and actually another job. And his first series of sculptures were built out of household objects, hoovers, washing machines, leftover objects. And I just thought that, like, that's something incredibly trivial in the first instance, but he managed to use a kind of form that was very familiar to his everyday life in order to invent something actually that the art world hadn't really seen before. So it's a moment for you to kind of center in on what it is that you already have, what it is that you're already working with, a material, an idea, a concept, and to kind of push it to its end. And that's what I think you're kind of left with now, is a kind of, you're all going to get your black bags filled with materials and all the stuff that you left behind in the building. And that, in a way, is the residue. That's the kind of compost out of which your next body of work will be made. And you never know, it might lead to a show at the Serpentine or the Tate 20 years down the line or 10 years down the line. But it's to realize that it's a process, and that you're constantly planting ideas in order to watch them grow in time, and to just be patient about that.
Yeah. Joe, did you, Joe Lawn, I noticed that you kind of put your camera on. Did you want to say something or ask something?
Hi, sorry, no, it was just when I was joining, my camera automatically went on. Sorry about that.
All right, okay. So you don't, okay. Does anybody want to chip in here and ask a question? I don't see anything in the chat. It'd be really great if anybody had something that they wanted to say or specifically ask Osei. No, I think everyone is. Are you all just exhausted? I think everyone's just exhausted. Yeah. Oh, here we go. Why are so many students' work not on the website? Well, from Kate. Oh, yeah, technical problems, and well, a couple of reasons, technical issues, but also taking part in the showcase was not compulsory. So we made a decision quite early on that we were going to kind of, for want of a better word, divorce your degree kind of submission and exam from the showcase. So it's not, you know, taking part of the show in the showcase. You're not being graded or anything. It's not part of that. It was more of an opportunity if students wanted to, and I sincerely hoped that they would, to show your work to a wider audience. And there have been technical issues. That's all. I don't understand what they are, and I know that the team are behind the scenes, you know, trying to sort these things out still, even though there's not a lot of time. The showcase goes live at 6:30 today to the wider world. These things that we've been doing today have been more a kind of invitation only kind of events.
Well, on that note, Mary, I should just say that, you know, I studied a course at Central St. Martin's that had a degree show element, and I didn't get to participate in it, partly because at that point I'd started working you know, for outside of university, and I just didn't have the time. But actually, for any of you that are not included in that showcase, do think about the fact that this is an opportunity for you to think, well, if I were to showcase my work on its own platform, whether it be a digital platform or a physical platform, what would that look like? I think actually being excluded, even though that wasn't the intention, it seems to me from what Mary's saying, is an opportunity for you to start to think about, well, what does it mean to be excluded, about the politics of exclusion? And often it's a kind of opportunity for you all to think about building your own platforms, creating your own spaces. And I think that's a really enriching one. So don't see not being included as a kind of end in itself. It could in fact be a beginning for some of you.
So do you think it's important for students to have their own website and that kind of thing? I know for me, it's something that just didn't exist when I left art school. You know, it was just not. Do you think it's imperative? I
think it's imperative, and I don't think it's for everyone immediately. I think some of you might not even have enough work, and it might not be worth paying for a website or setting one up. But for those of you who feel like you do have the work and you know exactly what it is that you want to put up, and there is enough material there for you to really sort of engage an online audience, it's a great way to go. Another route is, you know, Instagram. You can post your works that way. Another really good example would be to think about potentially doing things with a collective. So if there are 3 or 4 of you that want to pull together some money to effectively rent a space. You know, while I was at university, I was president of a society called the Curation and Exhibition Society, and pretty much no one cared about anything we did. But we would do a yearly showcase called Exhibit, and Exhibit was run through the student union. And it was a shame that they didn't get as much submissions as we'd hoped, but many people who applied for that were either previous students or existing students at UAL, and it was a really important platform. So, you know, the Students' Union was where I did my first 3 exhibitions, and I would say that about 4 of the artists in that show are now, you know, they're out there, they're having opportunities, and they're being shown sometimes internationally. So I think that don't underestimate the resources that are already at your disposal, and no opportunity is too small. And I think that's probably would be my biggest advice to you, is to kind of to see every platform as an opportunity to kind of put your work, offer your work up to an audience, and that through that process you will develop as artists. The audience is an extremely important part of your self-development. You're not making this work in a vacuum. Yeah. You're not the first people to make art in the history of time. You're not the first people to fail at making art, because people do it all the time. You're not the first artist to feel uncomfortable about whether your work is good enough. There are artists having mid-career retrospectives who feel that way. So that sense of constantly feeling like you're on the cusp, or that you're reaching the horizon, is actually part of being an artist. The anxiety is built in. Mm-hmm. And I would argue that if that's already seeming a bit too much, either work through it or consider whether this career path is for you. But I am saying it, you know, really from an honest standpoint, hopefully, that you recognize that actually the difficulty is part of what makes being an artist such an exciting and integral endeavor, that you're constantly trying to find ways to communicate with the world. And that's a privilege in and of itself.
Hmm. And in a sense, it's interesting that you say that, because, you know, I've been an artist for many years, but you kind of feel as though you're never going to get there. So in a way, that's the impetus. Do you know what I mean? It's like you've got this horizon that is kind of it, or there, or success, or whatever you might want to call it, and you keep putting one foot in front of the other in order to get there. And the more you do that, the further away it goes, like a bad dream, you know. And this is a really bad analogy, but that kind of keeps you going, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. You're exactly right, Mary. And I think to be committed to that sense of self-development that is so important, actually, for those of you also who are interested in curatorial work, it's not that different. I would say the main difference with curatorial work is that there are lots of things that you have to balance at once that are not necessarily about your own creative outlet. So you're thinking about the logistics of an exhibition, or how you're going to provide adequate support for the artist, or the budget. And those are all interesting things to think about. And I would argue that actually some of the best curators think like artists and vice versa. Yeah. So there's always, I think, a sense that you're going to want to, as Mary says, put one foot in front of the other, and maybe not reach that place, but actually it's the work, it's the daily work, the daily grind that is the most rewarding. For those of you who love being in the studio, I think that's a really good sign that you're on to being a great artist, because it's not easy at all.
And that's how you build a practice, isn't it? You know, it's about track record. You know, I like to encourage students, like, from now on, all of you, look for opportunities that you're eligible for, apply for things. It's relatively easy. I know there's sometimes cost is involved, but you know, have a folder on your computer where you might see something on a Monday and the deadline is Wednesday, but you've got your statement, you've got 20 or so images, you can tweak your statement for whatever the opportunity is, and just get it out there and just apply for things and look for opportunities, and etc. And that's how you build track record, which builds into a practice.
And to that point, you'd be surprised at how many opportunities that you think are, you know, oh, you know, that doesn't interest me, or I'm not exactly right for that, or you need this much experience and I don't have it, actually end up being the opportunities that change the course of your career entirely. So actually, at this point, nothing is minor. It's all important, because in fact what you're trying to do as artists is find a path that is unique to you, and none of you are going to have the same path. And it sounds like such a cliche, but I think we spend so much time at university kind of secretly resenting one another, thinking that someone is having a better time than us, or that someone's having more opportunities, or that someone's progressing more quickly, and none of that is helpful. And I think that if there's anything I could go back and give myself at university, is just a sense to not question what I was constantly doing, and to kind of not give myself credit for the work that I had done, to constantly think that I could have been doing better, but also to not compare myself to others, to see my journey as being unique to my experience, and my strengths and weaknesses as being part of that experience. So I would just really want to kind of impress upon each of you this idea that you are entirely in control of your own destiny. You've probably never had as much control over your own life than you have right now, which is kind of a scary thought. But you've never been freer. And I know that there'll be some of you coming to this as mature students that have already lives and jobs and children. And I completely understand sometimes the challenges that will bring, but to also remember that, you know, to give the example of Bill Woodrow, excellent work and really pragmatic thinking can come out of situations where you feel hemmed in or limited by circumstance. Freedom in the pure sense of not having to deal with other responsibilities is also not always a good thing. You need that balance, and maybe a sense that your time as an artist is finite, that you've got some of the day where you're doing your job, your 9 to 5, and then some of the day where you're working as an artist. And actually it will only, I think, revitalize and energize those 4 hours a day that you get to spend making work, rather than having 12 hours a day where you're spending half the time listening to, I don't know, doing what I do, which is probably procrastinating. So think about that.
On that note, I'll say thank you so much for being here and for talking to us and for looking at our students' work. It's been absolutely fantastic, and for giving us your time. And hopefully see you next year.
I look forward to welcoming you all to Tate Modern. We've got 2 exhibitions opening in the fall. Zanele Maholi is opening at Tate Modern in November, and Lynette Yedimbwachi is opening around the same time. So for any of you that want to reach out and come to the museum, and either, I know you're next door to Tate Britain, but I'm always happy to find ways to get you in, and hopefully if or any of you are also interested in future programs at Tate, I'd be really keen to talk to you about the work that we're doing.
Thank you, that's so generous of you. On that note, I'll say goodbye now, and goodbye everybody else, and hopefully encourage you all to get onto the showcase and invite your friends and family to have a look at it all, because it's absolutely fantastic. Thanks, Osei.